Welcome to Season 4 of Purposeful Empathy, a show dedicated to conversations with people from around the globe who understand the world needs more empathy and are doing something about it. Today's episode is brought to you by Grant Huron International, an on-demand coaching provider for individuals and companies. Thanks for watching. Enjoy the show. Welcome to a new episode of Purposeful Empathy. Today I'm joined by the fantastic Monica Modi Khant, who is the Executive Director of the Asian Pacific Institute on Gender-Based Violence. She is an experienced trainer and national keynoter who speaks powerfully about gender-based violence at the intersection of immigration law and rights, human trafficking, domestic violence, sexual assault, and asylum. Armed with a 23-year career representing immigrant clients who have been through tragedy, Monica has depended upon empathy to help them on their journey to healing. Welcome to the show, Monica. It's so great to have you.
Thank you so much, Anita. It's so great to be here and be a part of your show.
Yeah, and we have a bit of a sisterhood in common. I want to just flag the fact that we're both fellows with the International Women's Forum, and that's how I came to know you. So it's great to see you again. And what I also want to say at the top end of this conversation is that there's a lot of people that I've interviewed that study empathy. They're either psychologists or sociologists or neuroscientists, or they're in the mindful profession, or they're looking at leadership or user experience. In your case, you are in the practice of empathy, in the delivery, the service delivery of empathy. So you're really doing the work of purposeful empathy. And that's why I'm thrilled to have you on the show. And I'll start with a question because I found this really intriguing. I've heard you say that you have a love-hate relationship with empathy. So tell us what that's about.
Thank you. I know it's empathy is an emotion. It's a feeling that I've always had, even when I was a young child. And the love-hate relationship comes with not knowing as a young child and as I was growing and into my profession, of course, going through, undergrad and law school, it was always there with me, but I didn't know exactly how to act upon it, what to do with it. And so the love-hate relationship comes from knowing as a young child, I would connect with people's feelings. I would feel what they were feeling. And sometimes when you're younger, you don't know what to do with that. Sometimes you want to be unaffected. You want to run, you want to play, you want to, not care. And when I was younger, it allowed me to be in tune with other folks. And I found it being a little bit paralyzing, not knowing what to do with that emotion. And then as I grew older and I realized that I could actually use it as a superpower, it could be a strength, I began honing it in a little bit more and focusing on using it for good, using it with other folks. And of course, my journey in figuring out what I wanted to do with my career being a lawyer and why I went to law school also involved the use of empathy. So, the love-hate relationship comes from, okay, is this a useless emotion, or can I really use it in practice to help my clients and help others along in their journey?
Yeah. And, I watched your TED Talk, and we're going to have it in the description below because I really recommend people watch it. It was a really powerful, compelling talk. You shared the story early in the talk about, an experience that you had as a grad student, I think, or an undergrad student, and how that kind of many years later, you were able to connect some dots. Can you share that? Because I found it so compelling.
Yeah. Absolutely. So when I was an undergrad at Rutgers University in New Jersey, I was a hostess for a well-known Indian restaurant that a lot of folks would go to. It was a fancy restaurant that you would take your date to for Valentine's Day, or you would go to celebrate anniversaries. And so we always provided the best food, but also the best service. And, when I was 20 years old, my empathy there, I would see how some of the employees, the staff, how long they would work, the hours. I noticed that they were tired. I noticed that at the end of the day, they would all get into a van and drive away together to their home and they lived together. And I also noticed that they, would take naps in the restaurant because they were so tired and they were really on a clock. And so my empathy was kind of pinging at me, but I didn't know what to do with it. I felt some of their emotions, and, I didn't realize until I had gone to law school, became an immigration lawyer, worked with victims of human trafficking, that this actually years later was a labor trafficking case. And I was right in the middle of it. And at the age of 19, 20, I didn't know what was happening. There wasn't that awareness or that education at that time, that when you see folks who are working endless long hours, that there actually could be a red flag of labor trafficking happening there. And so my empathy was there. It was ringing, and I didn't know what to do with it. So I do have a little bit of looking back. Gosh, this was a situation that unfolded in front of me, and I didn't do anything about it.
And we probably all have had that experience, either
Absolutely.
Going to a restaurant, buying something when we're traveling, getting a manicure, who knows, right? And we have to be kind of more vigilant. We'll get into that in a second. I want to ask the question. Then you went on to do a law degree, and you could have, been a corporate lawyer, could have made super huge, big bucks. Instead, you went into immigration law, which is not known for like the cash cow of law. Why? What compelled you?
Yeah, for me, I always knew that I wanted to fight for justice. That's why I went to law school. And, that's actually one of my values: justice, transparency, having a voice. Those are my core values, which motivated me to go to law school, because I, growing up in an immigrant family, being first generation, being the first one born in the United States, there were a lot of cultural issues that I saw where women, South Asian women, I'm Indian, and South Asian women, I, saw my aunt, I saw some other women in the community being in domestic violence situations and not seeing a way out. And that affected me. Of course, the empathy was there, and that really, really affected me growing up. So at the age of 11, 12, I declared I'm going to law school, which is what I did. And I was always attracted, at law school to courses, to even clinics that would allow me to fight for the rights of others. And so when I left, law school, my first position was working as a detention attorney for asylum seekers. So when asylum seekers would come abroad to the United States back in 1998, and still now, they're detained in detention centers to fight their asylum case. So I was essentially a defense attorney for asylum seekers. And that's really, I'm glad you asked that question, because that's where I started using my empathy for the good of others. And even connecting with our clients, speaking with them, I was able to learn their stories and fight for their justice, fight for their release, fight for asylum for them. And that allowed me to, that was my first job as a 25-year-old young baby attorney. And that really charted the course for me for the work that I wanted to do. I was hooked. Once you see a client leaving a detention center and breathing their first air in the United States, because they went right from the airport to the detention center, it hooks you. And if you want to do that work, that human rights work, you just can't let it go.
So I had a set of questions, and we'll get to them because they're just too good and we want the audience to hear your answers. But I want to ask, since you've talked about asylum seekers, to just maybe comment a little bit on what's happening at the southern border in the United States. And over the last few years, we've all kind of watched with despair and horror what's happened to people seeking asylum. Could you share, having really understanding the fate and the lives of the people who are seeking asylum, could you speak to that to shed a little bit of light from your perspective on the situation?
Thank you for asking that, because it really is where I became hooked to representing asylum seekers. So, most asylum seekers are coming from countries where they feel persecuted, where there might be a militia or a group that the government cannot control. They may be, they may be in a situation where they have no assistance from government, domestic violence victims, for example, or gender-based violence. If you're part of the LGBTQ community and your country does not accept that, then you feel forced to flee because you are not safe in your country. So folks who are coming to the border have legitimate fears. They cannot go to their own law enforcement or government for assistance, and they really have to flee with their families or whatever clothes are on their back. Most recently, we've been hearing of so many folks coming from Venezuela, well-educated folks coming from Venezuela because of the political opposition that's happening over there. So whenever you hear of any turmoil in a country, that's where a lot of asylum seekers are coming from. And so the border comes into play because most folks are traveling through Mexico to come to our border where they can ask for asylum. You go to a border, you declare that you're fearful to return to your home country, and that's when the asylum, process begins. There are officers, immigration officers at the border. And so most recently, why have we been seeing many children, many adults at our border? Well, when we had the last administration, there were a lot of new policies that were put into place that really restricted asylum seekers to even request asylum. There was there was a policy that said request asylum from Mexico, which had never been a part of our law. You would come into the United States, you would be detained, but in the United States, you would ask for asylum. And this, new policy really threw everything askew. And then other policies, also on top of that, made things really difficult. And so there was a backlog of folks needing to apply for asylum who were dispersed, throughout Mexico and Central America because they could not, follow the protocol that had been set in place for years. So now you're hearing a lot about it because there's been a little bit of a, loosening of those policies. And so folks are coming because they had been probably pushed back for so many years. And the situation in other countries may not have changed. So the reasons for seeking asylum are still the same. It's just that the loosening has allowed more asylum seekers to come forward. And that's what the world is hearing about.
Yeah, thank you for that. And so I think, and tell me if I'm wrong, but having worked on the front lines with people who seek asylum, you really push back and reject the argument that this is, like an invasion and they're, bad guys, bad people coming across the border and want to take American jobs, right? They're just humans.
That's absolutely right. And I'll just unequivocally say it as an immigrant rights, advocate, but also an immigration attorney. When you hear, from the age of 25, and that was 23 years ago for me, when you hear what these asylum seekers go through, they've witnessed the murder of a parent, they've witnessed the rape of a sister, they've, themselves have, been targets of abuse, victimization, and violence. These stories are real. And, when you represent an asylum seeker and understand that, there's no way you can unhear or unsee what you have when you hear the stories.
Yeah, so that actually is a good segue to how do you believe you personally, but also like your profession, leverages empathy in the work that you do of representing immigrants and asylum seekers?
Yeah. So at the age of 25, I learned, that, and this was through trial and error. I will not say that I came into this knowing this at the age of 25 when I was a baby lawyer. But with this first position, you understand that if you give someone the space, the time, the guidance to, tell their story, and they needed to for their immigration case, because the more you can actually say, and, the more you can actually communicate how difficult it is to go back home, the more likely your case will be granted. I think, immigration judges want to hear details, and that's understandable. And so my job really as a lawyer was, of course, to represent them, based on the laws that we had here in the US, but it was also to help them understand the legal process. If you're coming from Sri Lanka, the Sri Lankan legal process is very different than the US legal process, especially for immigration. And so number one, I would start there. Number two, I would gain the trust of my clients so that they could feel comfortable sharing really difficult details that they may not have told anybody. If someone, if you were to meet someone for the first time and say, oh, I heard you've been raped, tell me about that. What the reaction will be. No one will feel comfortable. So it took many sessions, many, meetings in the detention facility under the umbrella of being detained for me to really build that trust with the client. And that's where empathy came in, because if a client feels that you understand what they're saying and that you feel for them, not just that you feel sad for them, but you actually feel for them, then they are more likely to tell you more, which will help their case in turn. But for me, that wasn't the end all be all just to win the case. Of course, I want to win the case so I can get them out of detention. But my goal was to be a part of their healing process and to help them, face what had happened, but also know that there is someone you're telling who is not shaming you, who is not making you feel bad for what has happened, who really is, helping you draw from that, talk about it, and then handle it, which is, in the best way that they want to. So that's where empathy really helped me connect with the clients and win their cases. And, as a baby lawyer, I won every single case and got, my clients released, and it was over 30 cases, so one after another. And I believe, I want to say it was my great legal skills. Sure, but I just came out of law school. I was not Ruth Bader Ginsburg at the age of 25. I do believe it was my empathy and in my communication with the clients.
Yeah, God bless RBG. Congratulations. That's a beautiful track record, and I feel like you were wearing multiple hats. You were, a lawyer representing them, and a social worker, and a psychologist, and a spoken word historian. How on earth did you cope with all of the secondary trauma? Like, you're hearing some of the worst and darkest stories that people have lived through, the grimmest stories that that humanity has got to offer. How did you keep your cup full and replenish your battery to do the work on a sustainable basis?
I love that question, because my answer to that at the age of 25 is very different than what I would answer now, 23 years later. And at that time, I didn't know better. I didn't know what keep my cup full even means, because you feel guilty, right? I felt very guilty as a lawyer that I was out, and, there were so many people in the detention center. So coming from that perspective, when you're young, it really burns you out. And I was burned out, and so I didn't know how to keep my gas tank full at that time. I would hang out with friends. I even got married during that time period, but I don't think I did much at that time to keep myself, going, because I didn't know better. And that's a lesson that I take forward to me with my team. And so, yes, I went through it and I burnt out, and I left that position after 2 years and being so good at it, because I didn't feel like there was another option for me. And so I take that lesson now moving forward when I work with other attorneys and other social workers who do this work. And my answer now is very different.
Hmm. So, as a leader, then, how
Yeah.
do you deploy empathy with your team, especially in your new role as executive director? I'd love to hear sort of like the empathy slash leadership intersection.
Yes. So, it took me a few years of, leadership training, coaching to really realize, Monica, empathy, okay, was great working with clients, but it's also valuable working with a team and building up leadership and, really understanding where a lot of my team members are coming from, understanding what drives them, especially in the nonprofit world, which may be different from the private sector. Because as you mentioned, it's not the cash cow. People don't go to the nonprofit world to make money. They go because they feel passion, they feel connected to the mission, they want to fight for something bigger than themselves. And so that's why, a nonprofit team really gets their fulfillment. But it's also what can also, have the vicarious trauma or the burnout. And it's where you don't really, practice self-care. And I know that because I did that, at the age of 25, and I experienced it firsthand. So when I went through a little bit of leadership training, the empathy piece for me was a motivator. And I learned, okay, it's also a strength when leading a team. And previous to my new role, I was an executive director at a smaller nonprofit where it was a grassroots legal organization where we provided pro bono asylum and, other immigration legal services for victims of domestic violence and human trafficking. And the team that was with me really was, of course, they were connected to the mission, but I could see when burnout would happen, and I could encourage them to take time, give them a few, activities or practices to follow so that I knew that they could come back. Because it's really sad to me when we lose, professionals in the nonprofit industry because of burnout. I almost got lost back in the day because I didn't know if I could take it anymore. And that's a big loss. So in leadership and in training, my team and in working with it, I spend a lot of time in the work environment, in the culture, in activities where you team build and work with each other so that you feel supported. Because I think one of the biggest, helps to not feeling burnout is to feel supported. So yes, you may have one bad day, you may have one client that you may not, whose case you may not have won, but you have support to get up the next day and do it all over again.
So, is there like a go-to activity or something that you do either yourself or with your team that allows you to kind of tap into that mutual support?
Yeah, I think bringing everybody together in one way and really recognizing what you're there for and reminding folks. So before every meeting, or as, when we start a staff meeting or when we start, any other activity, we talk about the positives, the wins. What are you there for? What did we accomplish, individually and collectively? So we really highlight that. I do, I also, as an executive director, both in both organizations, I would do either a Friday 5 or a Thursday 3, where I would give shout outs to the team and say, okay, here are 5 things that this amazing team did. We should all celebrate that. And so reminding folks of what to, actually be grateful for, what they've done to move the needle forward, I think collectively brings folks together, because then you have everyone cheering for each other and saying, yes, great job, Melissa, great job, Anne. And that builds the community and builds teamwork.
Yeah, celebrating the impact and the efforts along the way. So speaking of impacts, I wonder if you could share a little bit about the organization you're now running, and if you could even bring it down to a story of impact that would, give anybody who's listening or watching a real glimpse into like the powerful work that's going on.
So the new organization that I'm executive director of, and I just started there 2 months ago, is called, as you mentioned, the Asian Pacific Institute on Gender-Based Violence. And it's a national resource center in the United States that provides trainings, collaborations, resources, data, reports to organizations on the ground that serve the Asian American Pacific Islander population. And those organizations are the real ones doing the hand-to-hand work with the clients. And, where we don't work with clients at, API GBV, which is our, little acronym. But what we do is we help the serving organizations, feel supported and serve better. So it's bringing in that support with empathy that you want to bring. And it's also bringing in, the power, if you can all do it together, the collective action piece. And, one of the biggest things that really stood out to me and wanted me to even apply for the position was the bridge that the resource center provides between the on the ground nonprofits, but also the federal government here in the United States. So we can, tell the federal government what issues they're seeing on the ground, and we can vice versa tell the organizations on the ground what the government is wanting to do about it and initiatives that can be helpful. So that's another piece that's really important to me. And so the story, for me that even happened on day 2 that I started the position was the Atlanta shootings. The Atlanta shootings, happened March 16th in my backyard because I'm located in Atlanta, and the actual first site of that shooting was only 5 minutes away from me. And so being on the ground, hearing what's happening in Atlanta after the shootings, while everyone in the world is happening, but also starting at, the resource center on my second day, really put things in perspective to me, because many on the ground organizations were coming to us for their statement, for their words, because there's a connection. What we saw, a connection, it wasn't just a hate crime. It was a, gender-based motivated hate crime that happened. And everyone was really having their own talking points about, how they wanted to portray it. Law enforcement was saying on the ground that, oh, he just had a bad day, which drove us who are doing the work crazy, because that it's more deeper than that. So that day really showed me the impact that our words as a resource center could have, because I noticed many on the ground nonprofits asking us how we wanted to portray and what words we were using to really talk about what happened. And that's, again, where empathy really came in, because here you are talking about the actual incident, but there's also a family, friends who are left behind, who will never see their loved ones again. And that's where we rooted our statement from the family's perspective, because you really have to keep in mind who's left behind, and you want to honor, the victims that are lost. And so really just kind of navigating that on day 2 was an interesting challenge for me. But again, I had to depend on my empathy to get through that.
And I think it calls up for me another question around the increase in gender-based violence and domestic violence thanks to COVID, or as a result of COVID. Could you speak to what some of the early research is showing, and any data or any information that you have about that connection?
Absolutely. So with, COVID has definitely kept us more at home. It's locked us down. If anyone had an outlet, if a victim of domestic violence had an outlet to leave her situation, that has now been taken away from her because of COVID. Families are not working, and they're, now home together. And when you're home together, then, already even in a non-domestic violence situation, you might be getting on each other's nerves. But it's really volatile. It's, absolutely catastrophic. And it could be, life threatening for a victim of domestic violence to really further be at the hands in lockdown mode from, her abuser. And so studies have shown that, calls to domestic violence hotlines have gone down, especially in the early days of COVID, but also the court system, even though many family law court systems are still remaining open for those last minute restraining orders that, a victim may need or may seek. It's been difficult to even get to the courts, because of the, COVID situation. So we're going to absolutely see a lot of, there's going to be a lot of impact and outcome coming from the backlog of not reporting some of these crimes. Law enforcement isn't, called, or if they are called, then the abuser is right there. And if the victim, an immigrant victim, does not have access to a translator, then the abuser is the one translating usually. So it just really magnifies the problems that have been happening in domestic violence situations as it is. And, just like you mentioned at the border, we may see a backlog, that is the waters are going to be running, after the dam is lifted a little bit.
So we have to flex our empathy muscles for a lot of people. Again, this COVID is not just the pandemic, COVID-19 coronavirus. There are many other secondary impacts, and domestic violence is one of them. Mental health issues, loneliness, all of those other things. So we need to all step up and flex our empathy muscles. So as a final question, Monica, and this has been such a delight to have this conversation, even though we've covered some really heavy ground, like I think we're doing some real good education here. I wonder if you have a story that you could think of from your own life when you were on the receiving end of empathy on purpose, or what I call purposeful empathy, and what it's meant for you.
So, there are a lot of mentors that I've had that, also lead with empathy, and I'm drawn to those people. And, when I say a lot, maybe not a lot, but a few that I'm drawn to who also lead with empathy. And there's this one mentor, her name is Ann Kramer here in, Atlanta, Georgia, and she's very well known in Atlanta, Georgia. And she and I connected after we did a panel together. We were just placed on a panel, and that's when we got to know each other. And Ann is a shining example to me of someone who leads with empathy and love. And she has had a 50-year career in doing that. And as women, sometimes, we're taught to tamp down our empathy, lead with decisiveness, lead with, aggression sometimes. And she brought this beautiful to light story of how she was just a walking example of how someone can, lead with light around her, and how she brought that out in others. And so for me, when she directed that attention to me, not only did it allow me to believe that I could achieve everything that I wanted to, because you feel that support there, and you feel like you have someone rooting for you in the corner, but she was also an example to me on how she led others in the community, how she led younger professionals and allowed for them to believe that empathy could really be, it's not just a soft skill, it's something that's really needed. And so I take my marching orders from her, and I follow in her footsteps to really want to bring that to others and not go through the journey that I went through of, is empathy good? Is empathy helpful? And really just honor it and bring it to full light. So I needed to mention her because she is the first woman I ever saw who really just kind of owned it and led with it.
Mm-hmm. And what I think my takeaway as we're coming to the conclusion of our conversation is there's just, there's an empathy deficit, and so an endless opportunity for us to, on a societal level, spread our empathy. But then again, what your story reminds me of is like one person can show some empathy and some support to another. And it could have a powerful impact that you're still talking about her some 2 decades later. So thanks for taking the time to speak with me today. It was great to have you on the show. And I thank all our listeners and viewers. And we'll see you next week at Purposeful Empathy. Now, what if you had access to your own council of coaches to help you break free from your own thinking clutter, make that important decision, and liberate you from whatever is holding you back? At Grant Huron International, you get to select a coach of your choice anytime from anywhere. Visit granthuroninternational.com and harness the power of on-demand coaching